Detective Marple, Murder at Applecross Station, a classic 1920s mystery, a Miss Marple mystery, pastiche. Welcome, dear listener, to another tale woven with mystery, thriller, and suspense. A story that promises to intrigue and captivate. Shall we begin? Act 1. The Crash. The train was making good time, the kind of unhurried, confident pace that suggested no rush, no urgency. Just the steady clatter of wheels against the rails and the low hum of conversation rolling through the first-class carriage. The upholstered seats were plush, the kind of velvet that swallowed you up in expensive silence. Lamplight flickered against polished brass fixtures. Outside, the countryside stretched in long, dark smudges, punctuated by the occasional pinprick of a farmhouse window. Agatha Marple sat quietly, her small frame tucked neatly into the corner by the window. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a steady, patient rhythm that matched the pulse of the train. She had a way of blending into the background, a quality that often made people speak too freely in her presence. She neither encouraged nor discouraged them, just listened, tucked away details like a squirrel hoarding for winter. Across from her, a Colonel Hardwick, she thought his name was, thumbed through a newspaper, his moustache twitching with displeasure at the headlines. He struck her as the sort of man who disapproved of most things on principle. To her left, a Miss Lansing, all angles and crisp silk, fidgeted with the clasp of a small leather handbag, her fingers drumming against the metal like she was waiting for bad news. The clerk, Anthony Winfield, a wiry young man with spectacles that sat slightly crooked, scribbled furiously in a pocket notebook. His ink-stained fingers suggested someone who had spent his life buried in ledgers. Hardwick sat further down. Eloise Hardwick, slim and pale, clutched at a string of pearls like a drowning woman to a lifeboat. The Colonel, her husband, occasionally flicked his gaze at her, the sort of glance that weighed more than words. The stationmaster, Leonard Pemberton, had boarded briefly at the last stop. A man with a hunched, weary look of someone used to explaining why things weren't running on time. He stood stiffly by the door, staring out the window as though expecting something unpleasant. It was all perfectly normal, the kind of snapshot one might take of a perfectly ordinary evening. Then came the screech, a noise that wasn't just loud, but wrong. A jagged tear through the air that had no place in the orderly world of train schedules and first-class compartments. The wheels buckled beneath them, the carriage lurched, up, then sideways. Someone screamed, a high, thin sound cut short by the impact. The world tipped. Miss Marple's knitting basket went flying, the Colonel's newspaper fluttered into the air like startled pigeons. Then silence. For a moment it was the kind of silence that only follows disaster, thick with dust and disbelief. Then came the groans, the shifting of bodies, the shuffling of feet as passengers pulled themselves upright, checking limbs, wiping at scraped foreheads. The brass lantern above swung in a slow, hypnotic arc. Miss Marple was already steady, one hand gripping the armrest, the other reaching for the trembling hand of Mrs. Hardwick, who had come up against the floor rather harder than she liked. "There now," Miss Marple murmured. "All in one piece, are we?" The Colonel pushed himself up with a grunt, brushing off his coat, as though mild derailments were an expected inconvenience. "Damned nuisance," he muttered. "What the devil happened?" Anthony Winfield was already at the window, fumbling with the latch. "We're off the rails," he said, voice tight. Must have hit something, or the track gave out. Outside, smoke curled in thick grey ribbons from the engine up ahead. Sparks crackled along the rails. The first-class carriage had landed at an awkward angle, tilted just enough to make standing feel like walking uphill. Through the haze, a few dark shapes moved. Other passengers stumbling from the compartments, calling for help. A sharp rap against the door, the conductor, hat askew, his face smudged with soot. "Everyone all right in here?" His voice was edged with the kind of brisk efficiency reserved for people who had not just been in a train crash. The passengers exchanged glances. No immediate fatalities, a few bruises, some torn silk and scattered dignity. "Best get moving," the conductor said. Near a space to take shelter's Applecross Station. Not much, but it'll do till we sort things out. At the name, Pemberton stiffened, his gaze flicking to the window. Miss Marple caught it. A hesitation, small but telling. She smoothed her skirt, picked up her knitting basket from the floor. Applecross Station, she repeated. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in some time. The conductor was already moving on, ushering passengers toward the exits, down to the damp earth where the chill of evening settled into their coats. Pemberton hesitated a fraction longer, then cleared his throat. "It's old," he said finally, as if that explained something. "Mostly abandoned, not much there." Miss Marple tucked a stray curl behind her ear, watching as the passengers picked their way toward the distant lights of the station. "Yes," she said lightly, "but sometimes it's the empty places that hold the most secrets." She stepped out into the night. Behind her, Applecross Station loomed, its silhouette dark against the sky, waiting. The first thing was the rain. A slow, deliberate drizzle that had no interest in hurrying along. It wasn't enough to soak through, just enough to settle into the bones, to make everything damp and uncomfortable. The kind of weather that made a man irritable, a woman testy, and a mystery just a little more inconvenient. They came out of the wreckage like actors stepping onto a stage, one by one, shaking off the shock, brushing at coats, adjusting hats. The train lay at an odd angle, wheels half sunk into the soft, wet earth beside the rails, smoke curling sluggishly into the night air. Colonel Hardwick was the first to speak, because of course he was. "Well, don't just stand about," he snapped, straightening the lapels of his greatcoat. "Move along. No point gaping at the thing." His wife, Eloise, flinched at the sharpness in his voice but said nothing. She never did, not in public. She pulled her coat closer around herself, the pearls at her throat a pale shimmer against the dark wool. A few feet away, Anthony Winfield adjusted his spectacles with unsteady fingers. The clerk was small, wiry, and always nervous, the kind of man who looked like he owed money to someone at all times. "Where exactly are we?" he asked, voice tight. Miss Marple gave him a look, mild but precise. "Between where we were and where we intended to be," she said. "Although at present I'd say we're slightly closer to trouble than destination." Beatrice Lansing let out a sharp breath, exasperated. The woman had the kind of poise that suggested she always expected someone else to fix things before they could become her problem. "Well, we can't stay here, can we?" she said. "Surely someone should be coming for us." "They will, madam," the conductor muttered, "but not soon enough for my liking." His lantern swung in slow arcs as he surveyed the distant dark. Beyond the wreck, the landscape stretched out in rolling hills and patches of trees. No roads, no houses, nothing to suggest civilization except... "There," Miss Marple said, pointing. Far ahead, across the wide, rain-darkened field, a station sat nestled like an afterthought against the endless stretch of track. Applecross Station. A faint glow flickered from within. Light, shelter, and, if Miss Marple was not mistaken, a man standing just inside the doorway, watching. "Well," she said, brushing at the damp on her gloves, "I suppose that's where we're going." The colonel grunted, already stepping forward. "Come along then, no dawdling." "Rather ironic, don't you think?" Miss Lansing muttered, falling into step beside Miss Marple. "A railway station that looks as if it's been left behind by time itself." Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing thing. "Well," she said, voice light but firm, "sometimes the places time forgets are the ones worth remembering." And with that, they trudged through the misty dark toward Applecross Station, waiting. The station loomed ahead, a squat, forgotten relic, its stone walls darkened by decades of coal dust and neglect. Applecross Station had the look of something once grand, now left to sink into obscurity, like a retired prizefighter grown soft with age. The sign above the entrance was cracked, the lettering faded to a whisper of what it once had been. The drizzle had settled into a fine mist by the time the travellers reached the platform. The wind whistled through broken eaves, rattling an old schedule board that still clung to its rusted frame. The timetables it displayed were yellowed, the last updates years old. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the station. There was a quiet about the place, but not the kind that welcomed, the kind that listened. A single lantern burned near the entrance, throwing long, uneasy shadows. Just beyond its reach, the doorway gaped open like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The first movement came from the side office, a shuffle, a hesitation, and then Mr. Leonard Pemberton emerged. He was tall but stooped, the kind of man who had once commanded presence, but had since shrunk into himself. His uniform was faded, the buttons dulled, the sleeves frayed, deep lines carved furrows into his cheeks, his thin lips pulled into something that wasn't quite a scowl, but certainly wasn't a smile. He blinked at them as if their presence had disrupted something, a dream, a memory, something best left undisturbed. "We had an accident," the colonel barked, stepping forward like a man still used to giving orders. "Train derailed. We need shelter." Pemberton's fingers twitched at his side. His hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple caught it. A flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't just surprise. He wasn't just startled. He was alarmed. "Right," Pemberton said finally. His voice had the gruff, sandpaper edge of a man who spoke little and cared less. "Come in, then." He stepped aside, holding the door as the group shuffled into the station. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of oil lamps and damp stone lingering like ghosts of the past. The booking hall stretched wide before them, its vaulted ceiling cracked with time. The counters were empty, the ticket windows long since abandoned. But there had been something here once. Miss Marple's eyes swept the walls where old photographs were still nailed into place. She drifted toward them, running a gloved fingertip across the wooden frame of one. The images were faded, but not beyond recognition. One showed Applecross in its prime, the platform bustling, well-dressed travelers boarding steam engines, porters rushing with luggage. The next was a portrait, a younger Leonard Pemberton standing proudly in his crisp stationmaster's uniform. There was something in his face back then, something almost defiant, as though he had once dared the world to take something from him, and the world had obliged. Pemberton cleared his throat. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the rain off." Miss Marple turned, her expression placid but her eyes sharp. "Yes," she murmured, "I imagine this place has sheltered many things." Pemberton didn't answer. Outside, the wind howled through the broken rafters, and somewhere deep within the station, something creaked. The waiting room at Applecross Station had seen better days. Then again, it had probably seen worse, too. The air carried the stale scent of coal dust and damp wood, the kind of smell that clung to a place long after it had been forgotten. A rickety wooden table stood in the center, the surface scratched and uneven, surrounded by mismatched chairs that groaned in protest when sat upon. The fireplace, large but neglected, coughed out more smoke than warmth. An oil lamp flickered from a wall sconce, throwing long, exaggerated shadows across the cracked plaster walls. Pemberton stood over a small iron stove, boiling tea in a dented kettle, his shoulders hunched, movements mechanical. The station master wasn't a man accustomed to guests, and certainly not a dozen stranded travelers, looking to be made comfortable. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair by the fire, watched him with mild curiosity, hands folded neatly in her lap. She never minded a bit of dust. Dust, after all, was honest. It simply settled where it was left alone, and so did secrets. The colonel was less forgiving. "Is this the best you can do, man?" Hardwick barked, pushing his tin cup away as if it contained poison instead of weak tea. "You're telling me there's nothing more to eat?" Pemberton didn't turn from the stove. "That's what I'm telling you." Mrs. Hardwick flinched at her husband's sharp tone. Lowering her gaze to the murky liquid in her own cup, she always made herself small when he was in one of his moods. It was an old habit. Beatrice Lansing let out an exaggerated sigh, running a gloved finger over the edge of the table before inspecting it with disdain. "My dear Colonel," she said, shaking off a speck of dust like it had personally offended her, "surely you didn't expect a 5-course meal in a station that hasn't seen a train in a decade?" "The state of this place is an absolute disgrace," the colonel muttered. "Yes," Miss Lansing murmured, reaching for a small sandwich from the platter Pemberton had unceremoniously dropped onto the table. "It's positively barbaric." She took a delicate bite, then grimaced. "And so is this food." Pemberton snorted, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "You want caviar, lady? You're about 50 miles too far from the Ritz." Winfield, perched at the edge of his seat, fidgeted with his coat pockets as though checking for something, perhaps to make sure it was still there. His fingers, stained faintly with ink, moved with nervous precision. Miss Marple caught the movement and tucked it away in her mind, along with all the other quiet details she had gathered since they arrived. Winfield had a secret, that much was clear, but then again, so did everyone at this table. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. It was thick with unsaid things, the sort of pause that existed when people were too polite or too afraid to say what they were really thinking. Miss Marple reached for her tea, sipping carefully. The china cup was chipped. The tea itself was lukewarm and uninspired, but she had drunk worse in her time. Her eyes drifted between Hardwick and Pemberton. There was something unspoken there, something brittle. The way they avoided each other's gaze, the way Pemberton gripped the kettle too tightly, the way Hardwick bristled like a man expecting an argument that hadn't started yet. Miss Marple had seen that kind of tension before. It wasn't the tension of strangers. It was the tension of people with unfinished business. The wind had picked up outside, making the station's rotting wooden beams groan like an old man. Shifting in his chair, the rain had stopped, but the damp still clung to everything. The air thick with the smell of wet stone, decayed wood, and something else. Something stagnant. Inside, the waiting room had settled into a strange hush. The kind that wasn't quite peace, but rather a collective unease. The fire in the ancient hearth had dimmed to embers, casting flickering shapes onto the walls. Miss Marple had seen nights like this before. Nights when the air held secrets just waiting to be spoken aloud. Across the room, Colonel Hardwick paced, hands folded behind his back, the rhythmic clack of his shoes against the warped floorboards the only sound. He checked his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes, snapped it shut with a quick flick of his wrist. His jaw was set tight, his shoulders squared like a man bracing for impact. "Last inconvenience," he muttered, though it wasn't clear if he meant the derailment, the station, or something else entirely. Mrs. Hardwick, seated stiffly on a low-backed chair, reached for his arm. "Robert, please. There's nothing to be done now. We must simply wait until morning." Her voice was calm, placating, but Miss Marple didn't miss the tremor beneath the even tones. Hardwick shook her off, sharp, impatient. "You think that, do you?" His gaze darted to the dark windows, the station's empty corridors beyond. "Nothing to be done? That's what you always say." Mrs. Hardwick flinched. Small, but noticeable. Miss Marple, knitting, forgotten in her lap, watched without watching. The Hardwicks had a history that ran deeper than mere marriage and duty. She had seen couples like them before, two people bound not just by a shared past, but by a shared secret. "Robert," Mrs. Hardwick tried again, softer this time. "We are all in the same predicament. There's no use working yourself into a state." Hardwick exhaled sharply but didn't answer. Instead, he resumed his pacing, muttering under his breath. Miss Marple caught two words, quiet but distinct. "Old debts." It wasn't long after that Miss Marple rose from her seat, stretching as though wearied by the evening. In truth, she simply wanted a better look at the station. The others were settled, Beatrice Lansing leafing through a magazine she clearly had no interest in, Anthony Winfield hunched over, still fidgeting with his coat pockets, and Pemberton, the stationmaster, watching everyone from his place near the door, his face unreadable. Miss Marple slipped out into the corridor. The station was silent, save for the occasional moan of the wind pressing against the windows. The long hallway stretched ahead, lined with dusty doors leading to forgotten offices and storage rooms. She stepped carefully, her small frame moving with the kind of grace that goes unnoticed. And then, movement. A shadow. At the far end of the hallway, a figure hunched near a door, one hand on the rusted doorknob, the other rooting through his pockets. Anthony Winfield. Miss Marple took one step closer, just enough for her shoe to scuff against the wooden floor. Winfield froze, his head snapped up, eyes going wide behind his crooked spectacles. "Mr. Winfield," Miss Marple said, her voice pleasant, curious. "You seem to be having some difficulty there." For a moment the clerk didn't move. Then, in a quick, jittery motion, he stepped back from the door, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. "Mrs. Marple," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't see you there." Miss Marple let the silence stretch between them, observing the way his shoulders tensed, the way he licked his lips. A nervous tick. "Door appears to be locked," she remarked lightly. Winfield nodded too quickly, glancing back at the door as though hoping it would explain itself. Yes, it does seem to be." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you were quite intent on opening it." His fingers twitched in his pockets. "I was just stretching my legs. Got turned around, that's all." She smiled, small and knowing. "I see." Winfield swallowed, nodded again, then hurried past her, retreating toward the waiting room without another word. Miss Marple watched him go. Then she turned back to the door. "Records office." She pressed a gloved hand to the wood, feeling the cold seep through. There were secrets here. Secrets that people were willing to lie for. And perhaps secrets worth killing for. The wind outside had grown teeth, rattling the windows like a hungry thing trying to claw its way inside. The lanterns flickered against the gusts, throwing wild shadows that danced across the walls of the waiting room. Mrs. Hardwick sat stiff, backed in a wooden chair near the hearth, her pearl necklace gleaming faintly in the low light. She reached for her tea, then stopped, her fingers hovering over the handle. Her gaze swept the room once, then again, her mouth pressing into a thin, uncertain line. "Robert," she called, her voice not quite as even as she meant it to be. Silence, her fingers curled around the arms of her chair. "Has anyone seen my husband?" The others exchanged glances. No one had noticed him leave. Beatrice Lansing looked up from the magazine she had been pretending to read. He was pacing near the fire not 10 minutes ago. Anthony Winfield, still damp from his earlier misadventure in the hallway, frowned. "I thought I saw him checking his watch again, but that was before—" He hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "Before you got lost in the corridors," Miss Marple finished for him, her voice mild. Winfield swallowed. "Yes, I suppose so." A gust of wind howled through the rafters, and somewhere beyond the waiting room a door creaked, slow and deliberate. Mrs. Hardwick's gloved hands gripped the chair arms tighter. He wouldn't have gone outside, not in this weather. No one said it, but the unspoken question hummed in the air like a held breath. Where, then? Pemberton, standing by the doorway, cleared his throat. "AP, he just wanted a bit of space." "Robert doesn't go wandering off," Mrs. Hardwick snapped, her composure cracking like thin ice. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and stood. "Then perhaps we should find out where he has gone." It was not a suggestion. They searched the waiting room first. Nothing but a few battered benches, an abandoned deck of playing cards on a windowsill. The passenger corridors came next, the old wooden floors creaking underfoot. The lamps lining the hallway swayed with the wind, casting flickering light on dust-streaked walls. A door stood ajar to a luggage room. Empty save for a few forgotten trunks. No colonel. A side office. Papers scattered on the desk, a rusted ticket stamp. No colonel. Winfield tugged his coat tighter around himself, nervous energy buzzing under his skin. Can't have just vanished. Beatrice Lansing let out a hollow laugh. "No, but it certainly seems he has." Pemberton, who had been trailing behind them, suddenly stiffened as they neared the far end of the hallway, where a single door stood shut. The records office. Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened, how his fingers twitched like a man fighting the urge to reach for something. Perhaps a key, perhaps an excuse. Mrs. Hardwick's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she stepped forward. "What about in there?" Pemberton didn't answer right away. Instead, he squared his shoulders. "That's private property." The room seemed to grow smaller. Beatrice Lansing folded her arms, unimpressed. "Oh, don't be absurd. The colonel could be inside. Just open it, Pemberton." The stationmaster didn't move. "I said it's private." His voice was even, but there was something beneath it. Not anger, not defiance, something closer to fear. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, observing the way his eyes darted just for a second toward the key hanging on the wall behind the desk. A moment passed, then another, and then a distant sound from behind the locked door, a low, muffled thump. Pemberton's face drained of color. Mrs. Hardwick's breath hitched. "Robert." The wind outside screamed, and somewhere, just beyond that locked door, something moved. The scream cut through the night like a blade, sharp and jagged, sending a ripple of cold through the station's corridors. It wasn't the kind of scream that mistook a shadow for a ghost or a rat for a corpse. It was the kind of scream that meant someone had seen something they couldn't unsee. Miss Marple was already rising from her seat by the hearth when the waiting-room door banged open. Beatrice Lansing stood in the doorway. Her usual composure rattled like fine china dropped on a stone floor. Her gloves were twisted in one hand, the other pressed against her throat. "Someone's there," she gasped. "In the... God, I think it's a man. In the freight storage bay." Miss Marple's gaze swept across the others. Anthony Winfield had gone pale, his ink-stained fingers tightening around the edges of his coat. Mrs. Hardwick froze, one hand gripping the back of a chair as if to steady herself. Pemberton's face was unreadable, but the way he stared at Beatrice suggested he already knew what she had found. The storm outside had eased, but the wind still whistled through the station's broken rafters as Miss Marple lifted the lantern from its hook by the fireplace. "Yeah," she said, voice calm as ever. "We had best see what's been found, hadn't we?" The group moved as one, a cluster of shadows weaving their way through the dimly lit corridors. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed quickly by the old stone walls. The freight storage bay lay at the far end of the station, a vast, cavernous space filled with the detritus of a place long abandoned. Forgotten luggage, wooden crates marked with destinations long since erased by time, an old baggage cart left to rust. The doors stood slightly ajar, swinging gently on their hinges as though someone had just passed through them. Miss Marple stepped inside first, raising the lantern. The flame cast a pool of flickering light over the crates, illuminating shadows that shifted uneasily in the corners. And then she saw him. Colonel Hardwick lay sprawled behind the disused baggage cart, his body crumpled against the cold stone floor. He had not died gracefully. His pocket watch was smashed, the chain broken, its face frozen at exactly 8:20 p.m. A dark stain spread across his shirt, a color that needed no further explanation. His mouth was slightly open, as if caught in the middle of a final protest. Miss Marple moved closer, the lantern in her steady hand revealing details like a painter filling in the final strokes of a grim masterpiece. There was no weapon in sight, no clear sign of struggle. And yet the dust around him had been disturbed. The crates nearby shifted as though someone had fumbled in a hurry. Mrs. Hardwick let out a small, sharp gasp. Then her knees buckled. Anthony Winfield barely caught her before she collapsed in a heap. Pemberton stared at the body, not moving, not speaking. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. The kind that comes when death is no longer just an idea, but something real, something present. Finally, Miss Marple broke it. She exhaled softly, almost thoughtfully, as she set the lantern down beside the body. "Well now," she murmured, "this is rather inconvenient, isn't it?" And then, lifting her head, she let her sharp eyes sweep across the living faces around her. Because one of them had killed him. The room held its breath. The lantern's flickering light threw long, distorted shadows against the freight storage bay's crumbling walls, making the gathered figures seem more like apparitions than people. The damp air carried the scent of old wood, rusted metal, and something far fresher. something that no one wanted to name. Mrs. Hardwick remained slumped against Anthony Winfield, her frame small, fragile, as if folding in on itself. Pemberton stood stiff, his fingers twitching at his sides. Beatrice Lansing's gloved hands were clasped too tightly. Her usual air of casual detachment cracked, and then there was the body. Colonel Hardwick lay sprawled where he had fallen, his back against a stack of abandoned luggage, his legs at an awkward angle. One arm was outstretched, fingers curled slightly as though reaching for something. Or someone. The harsh glow of the lantern carved deep lines into his face, leaving shadows to settle in his sunken eyes. The silence threatened to stretch into hysteria until a voice, cool, measured, but well, Miss Marple murmured, smoothing her skirt as she knelt beside the body, the only one in the room not looking for someone else to take charge. I suppose we ought to make sense of this, shouldn't we? The others hesitated, caught between fear and the quiet authority of an elderly woman who did not hesitate at all. Miss Marple reached for the colonel's arm, careful but unflinching as she pressed 2 fingers against his wrist. She already knew what she would find. The flesh was cool, the stillness absolute. But she checked anyway. One must be thorough about these things. It's been dead for a little while now, she said, voice calm as if remarking on a poorly made cup of tea. The body hasn't quite stiffened, but the temperature suggests. She trailed off, glancing at the watch chain still clutched loosely in the colonel's other hand. The pocket watch had been torn from his waistcoat, its delicate casing cracked open like a broken promise. The hands were frozen at 8:20 p.m. Miss Marple lifted it gently, tilting it toward the lantern's glow. Now, that is interesting. Anthony Winfield cleared his throat, though it did little to rid him of the jitter in his voice. What's interesting about it? Miss Marple did not look up. A broken watch is always interesting, Mr. Winfield. It tells you 2 things: when the damage was done, and whether it was meant to be noticed. She let her eyes travel over the others, weighing reactions. Pemberton shifted on his feet, his mouth pressed into a tight, unreadable line. Beatrice Lansing's lips parted as though to object, but no sound followed. Mrs. Hardwick, still trembling, wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Miss Marple hummed lightly, not quite a tune, but more of a thought taking shape. And then she saw it. Near the colonel's outstretched fingers, barely visible in the uneven glow of the lantern, a piece of fabric lay curled against the cold stone floor. Miss Marple reached for it, lifting it between 2 precise fingers. A single embroidered glove, soft, expensive. The initials B.L. stitched neatly in the lining. Beatrice Lansing exhaled sharply, her face pale but composed. Well, she said, voice brittle, it isn't mine. Pemberton made a noise, something between a scoff and a curse. Then perhaps he just walked here on its own, Miss Lansing. Miss Marple turned the glove over. No blood. No obvious sign that it had been used in the act, but it was near the body, close enough that someone, perhaps the colonel himself, had tried to grab at it before he collapsed. She tucked it into her handbag. Best to hold on to this for now. And then, just as she was about to rise, something else caught her attention. The old baggage cart behind the colonel's body had a smear of something on its handle. Faint in the poor light, but distinct upon closer inspection. Miss Marple touched the edge of the stain with the tip of her gloved finger. A metallic scent rose from it. Not blood, not entirely. She rubbed it between her fingers, thoughtful. Will, she murmured to herself, standing. Pemberton eyed her warily. Find something? Oh, a few things. Miss Marple smiled faintly but politely. The trouble, you see, is deciding what they mean. She stepped back, smoothing down her dress. It's like a puzzle, isn't it? Some pieces fit together immediately, others... You need to wait until the right moment to see where they belong. She turned back to the group. I suppose the question is, who left the glove behind and who left the colonel dead? The storm outside had quieted to a murmur, but inside the real storm was just beginning. Act 2, Miss Marple takes charge. The air inside the freight storage bay had grown thick. Not with the damp of the station, nor the lingering smell of old wood and metal, but with the weight of unspoken things. The body lay still, but the tension in the room was alive, winding its way through each person, tightening around their throats. Miss Marple had seen it before. The moment when a room full of people realizes that one among them is a murderer. She set the embroidered glove down carefully atop a crate, brushed the wrinkles from her skirt, and straightened. The men were standing stiff, the women tense, expressions a delicate balance between horror and calculation. "Now then," she said lightly, as though she were preparing a parlor game rather than addressing a room of potential suspects. "Before we do anything foolish, I believe it would be best to make sure no further mischief is done." Pemberton, still lingering near the door, gave her a sharp look. "What are you suggesting?" She turned to him, mild but firm. "You knocked the doors, Mr. Pemberton. No one should be stumbling about near the body, contaminating the scene." His mouth pressed into a thin line. He didn't like the idea, but he wasn't fool enough to argue. He dug a key from his pocket, hesitated, then stepped forward and turned it in the heavy iron lock with a definitive click. Miss Marple gave him an approving nod. "Very good," she said. "Now then, let's all move back to the waiting room." There was a pause. One of those heavy silences where everyone is waiting for someone else to protest first. It was Beatrice Lansing who finally broke it. "I fail to see what good that does," she said, her arms folded in a posture that suggested she had never liked being told what to do. "We need to get help. There must be some way to contact the authorities." Mrs. Hardwick let out a strangled sob, hands trembling as she pressed a crumpled handkerchief to her lips. "She's right," she whispered. We must get the police." Winfield, whose colour had not yet recovered, looked anxiously between them. "There was a telephone at the front desk, wasn't there?" Pemberton, still standing by the locked door, shook his head grimly. "You can try, but I'll tell you now, it won't work." All eyes turned to him. "The storm," he said, gesturing toward the rattling windows. "Lines went down earlier in the night." Mrs. Hardwick let out a small, wounded noise, sinking into the nearest chair like a marionette with its strings cut. "So, what are we to do?" Beatrice demanded. Miss Marple adjusted the cuffs of her cardigan, her voice gentle but unwavering. "For the moment we stay put." Silence again. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't just the weight of a dead man in the room, it was the weight of a trap closing in. Anthony Winfield shifted, his shoes scraping against the floor. You think the murderer is still here?" Miss Marple smiled, and there was something sharp beneath it, something that wasn't at all fragile or grandmotherly. "Me, Mr. Winfield," she said pleasantly. "Where else would they be?" She turned, moving toward the door, the others trailing behind her. Behind them, Colonel Hardwick remained exactly where he had fallen, frozen in time, and outside the wind battered against the station, howling like it wanted in. The waiting room of Applecross Station had become something else entirely, a stage, a courtroom, a trap. The flickering light of the oil lanterns cast long, shifting shadows across the worn wooden floor, distorting faces just enough to make honest men look guilty and liars seem sincere. Miss Marple sat at the head of the room, not at the center, not looming, but precisely where she needed to be. She had knitted through funerals, whispered past scandals over tea, and seen men break down with a simple, well-placed question. She knew that silence was as much a tool as words. Tonight she had no knitting. Tonight she had murder. Leonard Pemberton sat on the edge of his chair, hunched like a man expecting a fight or a verdict. His uniform, frayed at the cuffs, bore the weight of years where dignity had been traded for survival. "You had a history with Colonel Hardwick," Miss Marple began, voice as light as if she were asking after the weather. Pemberton exhaled sharply, eyes darting toward the floor before fixing on the lantern glow. "I won't deny it." "Tell me." The room tightened around them, waiting. Pemberton's fingers twitched on his knee. "Hardwick ruined me," he said at last, voice rough. 20 years ago I was a rising man in the railway business, ran Applecross like clockwork, but then there was—" He stopped, glancing up at Miss Marple with something almost like reluctance. She nodded, just once, coaxing him forward. "There was an accident," Pemberton continued. "Freight train derailed just past the switch station. No fatalities, but it was a damned close thing. Hardwick was in charge of the investigation. He was military, had friends in high places. He needed someone to blame. And you were convenient." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "I was more than that. I was innocent." The words rang in the stillness. "Records were altered," Pemberton said bitterly. "The whole thing got swept away. I lost my post. I lost—" He stopped himself. "But I stayed." And he went on, "getting promoted for stepping on men like me." A heavy pause. "And now?" Miss Marple prompted. Pemberton's eyes were dark. "And now, he's dead." The statement hung there, daring someone to challenge it. "You must be relieved," Beatrice Lansing murmured. Pemberton gave her a look, flat, unreadable. "You don't get relief from ghosts, Miss Lansing. They stay with you." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest of her chair. A convenient story, a convenient motive. But convenience wasn't guilt. Mrs. Hardwick had been silent throughout Pemberton's confession, staring blankly at the lantern's glow. Her face was still pale, hands folded tightly in her lap. When Miss Marple turned to her, she stiffened. "Mrs. Hardwick," Miss Marple said gently, "do you believe your husband had enemies?" A sharp, brittle laugh escaped her lips, so sudden it startled even herself. "Enemies?" she repeated, voice thin. "Of course. Robert collected them the way some men collect cufflinks." A shiver ran through the room, the weight of truth finally settling. Miss Marple waited, knowing that if one pressed too soon, the door would slam shut. Mrs. Hardwick swallowed, shaking her head. "But you don't understand. It wasn't just business. It wasn't just men like Pemberton." Her voice dropped. "He did something terrible." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Whom?" Mrs. Hardwick looked at her, then truly looked at her, and for a moment it seemed as though she would say, "The thing that was pressing against her ribs like an iron weight." But then she looked away. "I can't," she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head, as if accepting an answer that was no answer at all. The truth was there. It had just not yet chosen to step into the light. Anthony Winfield sat perched on the edge of his seat, too still, his hands tightly knotted together like they might betray him if left to their own devices. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "Mr. Winfield, I believe you were lurking near the records office earlier this evening." His fingers twitched. "Lurking? A rather unfortunate word, I grant you, but not, I think, inaccurate." Winfield licked his lips, casting a glance toward the others. He hesitated. "I wasn't doing anything criminal, I swear." Beatrice scoffed. "That's exactly what people say before they're arrested." Winfield glared at her, then sighed. "I was just curious," he admitted, his voice lowering. I know something about the old freight scandal. I saw a name in an old ledger once, years ago. It's haunted me since. I thought maybe if I could just check the files." His voice trailed off. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And what name were you looking for, Mr. Winfield?" He hesitated, something shifting behind his eyes. Finally he muttered, "Hardwick's." A soft, collective intake of breath. Pemberton exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Of course he was involved in that. It all makes sense now." Miss Marple sat back, her expression thoughtful. Something was missing. The threads were coming together, but the tapestry was incomplete. The wind outside howled again, rattling the windows. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and smiled faintly. "Yes," she murmured, mostly to herself. "It all makes sense." But not in the way any of them expected. The storm had passed, but Applecross Station remained wrapped in its own kind of hush. The early morning drizzle tapped soft, insistent fingers against the roof, and the wind, though calmer now, still whispered along the eaves, rattling old timbers like a reminder. Inside, the station was stirring. Sleep had been fitful. If anyone had truly slept at all, a night spent in the company of a murderer does little for restful slumber. Miss Marple had risen before dawn. Old habits. People gave themselves away in the quiet hours when they thought no one was watching, but she was always watching. Now, with a lantern in one hand and a sharp eye for the details that others missed, she stepped carefully into the corridor that led to the freight storage bay. The floor bore a story in smudges and streaks. The dirt and damp from last night's storm had left its mark, and in the dim glow of her lantern Miss Marple could see a trail of muddy footprints winding toward the locked storage bay. She crouched, inspecting them closely. The prints varied. Some were broad, likely from Pemberton's heavy station boots. Others were finer, narrower. She followed them back along the corridor, her mind piecing together who had walked here and when. One set stood out. Small, close-together steps, hesitant, almost furtive. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the waiting room, where Anthony Winfield sat rubbing his temples, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. She straightened, her lips pressing into a faint smile. "Well," she murmured, "curiosity does tend to leave tracks." The records office had been left unlocked sometime in the night. That was interesting. Miss Marple pushed the door open, stepping into the scent of old paper and dust, the kind that settled deep in the bones of a place long neglected. A lone wooden desk sat beneath a flickering oil lamp, its surface worn by years of signatures, schedules, and decisions that had sent trains and men alike to places they ought never have gone. She scanned the shelves. Most of the logs were untouched, their bindings stiff with disuse. But one section gaped open, a few loose pages curling at the edges, as though torn hastily from a ledger. Miss Marple ran a gloved hand over the empty space where they should have been. There were two possibilities. Someone had taken those pages to hide something, or someone had taken them because they already knew exactly what was missing. She suspected the latter. Her fingers traced the spine of a thick register, flipping it open with care. The remaining entries were fascinating, even in their absence. Dates, numbers, train schedules from 20 years ago, the same year as Pemberton's scandal. The same year Hardwick had made his career by investigating a railway disaster. She turned the pages, her mind fitting together the shape of something just out of reach. She closed the ledger and stepped back into the corridor where the dawn light was beginning to creep through the broken station windows, casting long golden bars against the damp floor. And there, half hidden beneath a bench just outside the waiting room, something caught the light, a glove, not just any glove. Miss Marple crouched and retrieved it, turning it over in her hands. Fine material, a delicate embroidered initial sewn into the lining. B.L. Beatrice Lansing. Miss Marple stood, brushing the damp from her fingers, and studied the empty hallway. Someone had dropped it here, perhaps in haste, perhaps in panic, and yet Beatrice had claimed it wasn't hers. Miss Marple smiled to herself, tucking the glove carefully into her handbag. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, not without amusement, "you must be more careful where you leave your things." And with that she turned back toward the waiting room where the suspects, some guilty, some merely afraid, waited for the morning to decide their fate. The booking hall of Applecross Station had never felt more like a courtroom. Miss Marple sat in one of the wooden chairs near the unmanned ticket counter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the station's gloom pressed inward, the weak morning light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating more dust than truth. The others sat or stood before her, lined up like actors in a play waiting for their cues. The body of Colonel Hardwick was gone, locked away in the freight storage bay, but his presence lingered, hanging heavy in the air. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime listening to village gossip, to hurried confessions made over tea, to silences that meant more than words. She listened now, as much to what was not said as to what was. Beatrice Lansing sat stiff back in a chair, her lips a thin, taut line. "You claim," Miss Marple said presently, "that you were in the waiting room the entire evening?" "Yes." Beatrice's voice was crisp, the edges of her composure razor-sharp. "I never lift. I would have no reason to." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "And yet," she murmured, "your glove was found near the freight storage bay?" A small, visible shudder ran through Beatrice before she tightened her jaw. "That means nothing. Someone must have taken it. Stolen it from my coat pocket." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger lightly against the armrest of a chair. "And yet you claimed last night that it wasn't yours at all." Beatrice hesitated, just for a moment before recovering. "I was startled, and really, Mrs. Marple, must we fixate on a glove when there's a murderer among us?" Miss Marple smiled, soft but sharp. "A glove is a very interesting thing, Miss Lancy. It covers the hand, after all. And hands," she paused, letting the words sink in, "are what commit murder." Beatrice exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. "You've got it wrong." Miss Marple let the silence settle before turning her gaze to Anthony Winfield. The young man sat hunched forward, rubbing his ink-stained fingers together. He looked like he hadn't slept, perhaps because he hadn't. "Mr. Winfield," Miss Marple said, "you were seen near the records office last night." His jaw clenched. "I wasn't doing anything illegal." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "That wasn't what I asked." A bead of sweat formed at his temple. I was looking for proof," he admitted finally. "Proof of what?" Winfield took a deep breath, as if weighing how much to say. His glasses slipped down his nose, and he pushed them back up before answering. "I used to—" He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "There was a time I was very good at making things disappear. Paperwork, mostly. I forged documents. A long time ago." Beatrice made a sound in her throat, something between a scoff and a laugh. "A forger? Well, that's rich." Winfield's hands curled into fists. "I stopped years ago. I've been trying to make things right." He looked at Miss Marple, eyes dark with something close to desperation. "That's why I was in the records office. I needed proof that Hardwick was doing exactly what I used to do." Miss Marple waited. Winfield exhaled shakily. "He was blackmailing people, using old railway logs, records of accidents, missing shipments, falsified reports. If he had dirt on someone, he used it. I was trying to find out how many people he'd destroyed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Winfield hesitated. "No," he admitted, "because someone else got there first. The old logs were already gone." She studied him. A guilty man could lie convincingly, but a frightened one rarely knew how to hide the truth. Finally, she turned to Mrs. Hardwick. The Colonel's widow sat with a stiff sort of grace, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had not spoken much since the body was found, and now, as Miss Marple's attention turned to her, her shoulders tensed like a violin string about to snap. "Mrs. Hardwick," Miss Marple said, her tone gentler than before. "You said last night that your husband had many enemies." Mrs. Hardwick swallowed. "Yes." "And he had debts." A slight nod. "What kind of debts?" For a moment the only sound in the station was the steady patter of rain against the windows. Then, very softly, Mrs. Hardwick said, "Debts of honor." Beatrice made a disbelieving noise. "Honor?" Mrs. Hardwick's gaze snapped to her, and for the first time that night her voice held steel. "He wasn't always a cruel man." Miss Marple did not interrupt. She let the woman find her own words. "He owed money," Mrs. Hardwick admitted, not looking at anyone directly, "to the sort of people one does not refuse. And so he found ways to pay, using what he knew, what he had buried." Winfield's head jerked up. "You mean the blackmail?" Mrs. Hardwick flinched, but she didn't deny it. "He was desperate," she murmured. I tried to make him stop, but it was never enough. He said there was one last payment to be made." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And you know who that payment was meant for?" Mrs. Hardwick's hands trembled. "No," she whispered. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh, leaning back in her chair. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still too many gaps. A glove that should not have been found, a past that refused to stay buried, a debt that had to be paid, and a murderer who was running out of places to hide. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, surveying the uneasy faces before her. "Well," she said lightly, "this is all rather illuminating, isn't it?" Her voice was calm, her eyes were not. The air inside Applecross Station was thick, a weight pressing down on the occupants like an unspoken accusation. It was midday, but the light barely touched the place. The sky remained overcast, and the dim glow from the oil lamps made the station feel more like a room with the curtains drawn against reality. The exhaustion was showing. No one had slept well. The strain of spending the night in a place haunted by murder and suspicion was beginning to fray the edges of even the most composed. Miss Marple, seated in her usual, unassuming manner, observed the room through half-lidded eyes, a picture of serenity that was entirely deceptive. She could see it, the way nerves were stretched thin, the way hands twitched, voices snapped a little too quickly. It was time to test the limits of their stories. Leonard Pemberton leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. He had the look of a man who had carried too many burdens for too long and had grown comfortable in his resentment. "I told you already," he grumbled. "I was checking the damn generator. You all want the lights on, don't you?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "At precisely 8:20 p.m., Pemberton gave a sharp nod. "Yes." "And where is the generator located? Storage room past the ticket office?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Quite far from the freight storage bay, wouldn't you say?" Pemberton shifted, his fingers tapping impatiently against his sleeve. "I wasn't near the freight bay, if that's what you're asking." "It's not what I'm asking," Miss Marple said mildly. "It's what I'm confirming." She let the silence stretch before adding, "And did anyone see you there?" Pemberton's jaw tightened. "No. I was alone. A rather unfortunate thing, being alone at the precise moment of a murder." Pemberton exhaled sharply through his nose. "I don't care what it sounds like. I was there. I had work to do." Miss Marple studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Of course, but you must admit it's terribly convenient that no one can say for certain." Pemberton's fingers curled into a fist, but he said nothing. Beatrice Lansing had maintained an air of crisp elegance throughout the night's ordeal, but now the strain was beginning to show. Her composure was still in place, but it had become a brittle thing, liable to snap. "I was with Mrs. Hardwick," she said, voice clipped. "Etching blankets. Surely that puts me in the clear?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Mrs. Hardwick, who sat in a fragile hush. "Mrs. Hardwick," Miss Marple said gently, "can you confirm that?" Mrs. Hardwick hesitated. Too long, she opened her mouth, closed it, then pressed shaking fingers against her forehead. I don't know." Beatrice's head snapped toward her, a flicker of something dangerous flashing in her eyes. "We went together," she insisted. Miss Marple's tone remained polite, but her eyes were sharp. "But where exactly did you go?" Beatrice exhaled in frustration. "I told you, down the main corridor, past the first storage room. I reached for the door, but it was locked." Miss Marple blinked. "Locked?" Beatrice folded her arms. "Yes. It wouldn't budge, so I turned back." "That's odd," Miss Marple mused. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "What's odd about it?" Miss Marple smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, "because that particular storage room has no lock." Beatrice stilled, her mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. Miss Marple let the revelation settle before continuing, her voice perfectly even. "And you see, if a door without a lock does not open, it can only mean one of two things. Either someone was holding it closed from the other side," she let that hang for a moment, "or there was never a locked door at all." Beatrice's fingers tightened into fists in her lap. "Are you accusing me of lying?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, no, dear. I simply think you may be remembering things rather conveniently." Beatrice exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue, which was more telling than if she had. The atmosphere in the station had shifted. The threads of their stories weren't quite lining up, and now everyone could feel it. Pemberton was trapped in his solitary alibi. Beatrice Lansing was tangled in the contradictions of her own words. Mrs. Hardwick sat like a woman who was holding something back, something she couldn't say, or perhaps something she was too afraid to admit even to herself. Miss Marple took it all in. A faulty memory, a lonely excuse, a door that had never been locked. The murderer was in this room. And soon they would have nowhere left to hide. The corridor stretched out in long, dim shadows, the flickering oil lamp casting a weak glow against the damp stone walls. The waiting room behind them still buzzed with tension. Muttered accusations, uneasy glances, the kind of nervous energy that brews in the presence of a murderer. Miss Marple, however, had always known that the most important confessions were never made in a crowded room. She walked quietly beside Mrs. Hardwick, matching her slower, more delicate steps. The woman looked as if the weight of the past few hours had settled into her very bones, making her smaller, frailer than she had appeared the night before. At last, near an old timetable board, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You knew, of course," she said, "that your husband had more enemies than he could count." Mrs. Hardwick halted, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief she'd been twisting in her lap all morning. She let out a breath, weary, as if she had spent years holding something in and had only just realized it. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The storm had left the station with a heavy dampness, the air still thick with the scent of rain and coal dust. Somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter rattled, then fell silent. Mrs. Hardwick turned to Miss Marple, her tired eyes searching the older woman's face, as though debating whether it was safe to speak at all. And then she made her choice. "Eleanor Pemberton didn't cause that railway accident 20 years ago," she said. "Robert did." Miss Marple was not surprised, though she made a small, murmured sound of encouragement. Mrs. Hardwick went on, her voice hoarse. "Pemberton was an easy target. He had no connections, no influence. My husband needed a scapegoat, and Pemberton was there, young, ambitious, and in the wrong place at the wrong time." Miss Marple studied her, noting the way she spoke carefully, deliberately, as if each word was a step across thin ice. "Pemberton never had a chance," Mrs. Hardwick continued. "The official investigation, Robert controlled it, and then came the falsified reports, the testimonies that suddenly changed. He made sure Pemberton would be disgraced forever." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And you let him?" Mrs. Hardwick flinched just barely. She stopped. "I didn't know. Not at first. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. Robert had already won." She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. That was how he operated. Always a step ahead, always knowing how to bury a thing before it became a problem. Miss Marple's eyes darkened, her mind assembling the missing pieces. Robert Hardwick had built his career on ruining men like Pemberton, and when the past had threatened to surface, he had turned to blackmail. But someone had decided they wouldn't let him bury the truth again. Mrs. Hardwick leaned against the cold stone wall, pressing the handkerchief to her temple as though she could rub away the years. "He never stopped," she murmured. "The blackmail. It wasn't just about Pemberton, it was everyone. Officers, politicians, businessmen. He knew how to dig up dirt and how to make them pay for their silence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet even he must have known that one day he'd push someone too far." Mrs. Hardwick's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think he knew." Her voice dropped lower. "But I don't think he cared." The older woman remained silent for a moment, considering. She had known many men like Robert Hardwick in her time, men who mistook power for invincibility, men who never saw their own demise creeping up behind them. Miss Marple let the pause settle before speaking again, this time with a calculated air of curiosity. "Then tell me, Mrs. Hardwick," she said, smoothing her gloves. "Do you know what business your husband had with Miss Beatrice Lansing's family?" Mrs. Hardwick stiffened, a fraction of a second, a flicker of something sharp, something pained. She hesitated. "I don't know." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she noted the hesitation. Mrs. Hardwick was a woman who had been forced to keep secrets for decades, and this was one she wasn't ready to give up. But Miss Marple had seen what she needed to. The truth was there, just beneath the surface. A tangled connection between Robert Hardwick and Beatrice Lansing's family. A betrayal buried so deeply that it was still poisoning the present. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Well, my dear, I suppose we shall have to find out." But the way she averted her eyes was answer enough. The storm had passed, but Miss Marple could feel it. The real storm was just beginning. The waiting room of Applecross Station had the heavy stillness of a stage before the curtain rises. Outside, the storm had begun its slow retreat, but the sky remained a sullen shade of grey, and in the distance, lightning cracked once, briefly illuminating the barren railway tracks. Inside, Miss Marple arranged the chairs into a loose circle, an act so unassuming that no one quite realized what was happening until they had all taken their places, the suspects, because that's what they were now, stripped of pleasantries, shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. The room, though warm from the dying embers in the fireplace, felt cold. Miss Marple sat last, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her expression placid, but with an unmistakable weight behind it. She had gathered them here for a reason. And they all knew it. The silence stretched. Anthony Winfield crossed and uncrossed his legs, his fingers twitching against his coat. Beatrice Lansing sat rigid, chin tilted slightly upward, as if defying accusation before it could come. Pemberton scowled at the floor, his jaw tight, while Mrs. Hardwick sat, small and motionless, her fingers knotted in her lap. Miss Marple allowed the discomfort to settle before speaking. "Last night, Colonel Hardwick was murdered." She said it plainly, as if she were announcing a delayed train arrival. At 8:20 p.m. by the Colonel's own watch, he was struck down in the freight storage bay. She looked around, letting her words land where they would. "And while we have spent a great deal of time uncovering motives, half-truths, and convenient misremembrances," here her eyes flickered toward Beatrice, "what we must now determine is who precisely killed him." She let that hang in the air for a moment, then exhaled soft. "Fortunately, we now have all the pieces." Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost conversational, as she walked them through the timeline. At 8 p.m., the Colonel left the waiting room. We know this because Mrs. Hardwick noticed his absence. She turned slightly toward Pemberton, who had not lifted his gaze from the floor. "You claim you were checking the generator at that time, alone." Pemberton's lips pressed into a thin line. "I told you the truth." "Yes," Miss Marple said lightly. "You did." She turned next to Beatrice Lansing, whose posture hadn't relaxed once since the conversation started. "And you, Miss Lansing, claim you were with Mrs. Hardwick fetching blankets, though unfortunately Mrs. Hardwick's memory is too hazy to confirm this." Beatrice's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. "You also mentioned encountering a locked door in the station," Miss Marple continued. "A rather unfortunate error, as that particular door does not have a lock." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple gave her a small, pleasant smile and continued. "And then, of course, there are the footprints leading to the freight storage bay. The same footprints that, upon careful examination, match Mr. Winfield's shoes." Anthony Winfield went very, very still. I wasn't," he stammered. Miss Marple waved a hand lightly. "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Winfield. I don't believe you killed him." He blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. "But you were there, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked. "Perhaps to search the missing railway logs that had been so conveniently stolen?" Winfield's face was pale. He swallowed hard. "Yes," he admitted finally. Nay, I went there after I saw the colonel leave. I thought if I could get into the records office before him, I might find what he was hiding. And did you? Winfield's apple bobbed. No, the logs were already gone. Miss Marple nodded, another piece falling into place. And yet we found one final clue, didn't we? She turned back toward Beatrice Lansing, who hadn't moved. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out the glove. Delicate, finely embroidered. B.L. sewn into the lining. Yours, I believe, she said gently. Beatrice's expression didn't change, not at first. And then the mask cracked. Beatrice let out a slow, shuddering breath, her composure fraying at the edges. My father, she murmured. It was about my father, wasn't it? Miss Marple gave a single nod. Robert Hardwick ruined more than just one man's life, she said. And it wasn't just Pemberton, or those he blackmailed. It was your father. Beatrice closed her eyes. He destroyed him, she whispered. Silence settled over the room. My father was a railway contractor, Beatrice continued. There was an incident, a missing shipment, falsified records. He was blamed. His reputation was ruined. He drank himself to death 2 years later. Her voice hardened. And all the while Colonel Hardwick thrived. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. You found out the truth, she murmured. Beatrice gave a small, broken laugh. Not until recently. I found letters. Old correspondences between Hardwick and my father. It was all there. He had been blackmailing him, bleeding him dry until there was nothing left. Her fingers tightened into fists. So I came here. I wanted to confront him. I wanted him to pay for what he did. But I didn't kill him. A beat. Miss Marple watched her closely, and then a soft exhale. No, Miss Marple said finally. I don't believe you did. Beatrice's head snapped up. But someone did, Miss Marple continued, looking at each and every person in the room. Her voice, still quiet, still gentle, carried more weight than the storm outside ever had. And it's time, she said, to bring them into the light. The room stilled, and somewhere outside the thunder finally ceased. The waiting room of Applecross Station felt smaller now, as if the very walls were closing in around them. The air, thick with the scent of smoke and damp wool, carried the weight of too many unspoken fears. Outside, the sky remained a bruised shade of grey, the last remnants of the storm grumbling low over the hills. Inside, no one spoke, no one moved. They were waiting for the moment when one among them would no longer be a suspect, but a murderer. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression almost mild. But her gaze, sharp as a blade and just as unforgiving. She let the silence stretch. Then, softly, I imagine it wasn't planned, she said. Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, the way one might coax a confession from a frightened child. Across from her, Beatrice Lansing didn't move. Not at first. You lured him to the storage bay, Miss Marple continued, her tone soothing but unyielding. Didn't you, my dear? Beatrice exhaled sharply, but she still wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Miss Marple watched her carefully. You knew he was expecting payment, she went on. A final installment, perhaps, to close out one of his many, shall we call them, debts? Beatrice's shoulders stiffened. You told him you had the money, that he should meet you in the freight storage bay. Away from prying eyes, the others in the room sat frozen, their breath held as if any sound might shatter the delicate balance of the moment. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. But you didn't bring him money, did you? Slowly, Beatrice lifted her head, her eyes, so carefully guarded, so well practiced in deception, but now just tired. You have no proof, she murmured, but the words lacked conviction. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, proof is a peculiar thing, she said. It's not always found in what is seen, but rather in what cannot be explained away. She gestured lightly with one hand. The glove, the footprints, the missing railway logs, the Colonel's broken watch. That last detail made Beatrice flinch. You see, Miss Marple continued, when someone dies in a moment of surprise or panic, they often leave behind a single truth they didn't mean to. She leaned forward slightly. The Colonel's watch stopped at precisely 8:20 p.m. when he was smashed against the ground. Miss Marple let the words sink in. You struck him, Miss Lansing, didn't you? Beatrice's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. A moment passed, then another, and then her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists against the fabric of her dress. Yes, she whispered. The confession didn't feel like a victory, it was a slow collapse. I met him there, she said, her voice flat, detached, as if the words were spilling from someone else's lips. I wanted to confront him, to make him admit what he'd done. A ragged breath. He just laughed at me. Her hands trembled now. He said I was a fool, that I would never be free of him, that I was just like my father, weak, pathetic. The words caught in her throat. And then her voice broke, and then I hit him. Silence, no one moved. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was no softness to the truth. You used the iron lever from the baggage cart. Beatrice nodded, her expression unreadable. He fell back. I thought he would get up, but he didn't. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I watched the blood spread. I remember the sound of the watch shattering when he hit the floor. And then she exhaled sharply. I ran. Miss Marple gave a slow, measured nod. And in your haste, you dropped your glove, she murmured. Beatrice's mouth twisted in a grim, humorless smile. Fitting, isn't it? She murmured. My father lost everything because of a single missing document, and I lost everything because of a single missing glove. She let out a breath that sounded too much like relief. I suppose, she said quietly, that's what you'd call justice. The room remained silent as Beatrice Lansing sat back, eyes closed, hands resting in her lap like she was finally free of a weight she had carried for too long. Pemberton looked away, his jaw tight with something like understanding. Anthony Winfield sat frozen, still pale, still processing. And Mrs. Hardwick? She simply stared at the floor, as if she had known all along that it would come to this. Miss Marple sat back, watching them all. The storm had passed. The train would eventually come. And Beatrice Lansing would leave Applecross Station in handcuffs. But in the end, that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the truth. And the truth had finally been spoken. The storm had spent itself. By dawn, the sky had washed clean, a pale shade of blue stretching over the hills, the air crisp with a kind of cold that cleared the senses. The ground still held the memory of rain, puddles forming in the uneven cracks of the station platform, soaking into the wooden steps that led down to the railway. The waiting room of Applecross Station was silent, the tension that had gripped it now unwinding, unraveling in slow, tired breaths. But the weight of the night's events remained. Miss Marple sat by the window, watching as a lone motorcar rumbled down the muddy road, kicking up water as it approached. A local constable stepped out, adjusting his cap against the cold. He was a stocky man, his uniform slightly too tight at the buttons, his eyes sharp but tired. "Which one?" he asked briskly, stamping his feet to shake off the morning chill. Miss Marple rose from her chair, folding her hands neatly. "She's outside," she murmured. Beatrice Lansing stood at the top of the station's steps, her coat pulled tight around her as the wind cut through the morning stillness. Her face was pale, but there were no more sharp retorts, no brittle defenses. She had nothing left to argue. The constable approached, his expression unreadable. "Beatrice Lansing, I'll need you to come with me." For a moment she didn't move. Then, with a slow, measured breath, she nodded. Her heels clicked softly against the wood as she descended the stairs, her steps deliberate, unhurried. The wind caught the hem of her coat, lifting it slightly as though trying to pull her back, to keep her from leaving the station behind. Miss Marple followed at a distance, observing as Beatrice reached the bottom step. She hesitated. For just a fraction of a second her fingers clenched at her sides, her throat bobbed as though she meant to say something. To someone, maybe to no one. Then she exhaled, and the moment passed. The constable opened the door of the motor car, and Beatrice stepped inside. As the door clicked shut, Miss Marple saw the first tear slip down Beatrice's cheek. It mingled with the rain, and then she was gone. At the edge of the platform, Leonard Pemberton stood apart from the others, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His face was unreadable, but Miss Marple had long since learned how to read the silence of a man who carried too much of the past on his shoulders. She walked toward him, her steps unhurried, her presence unintrusive. "We'll be opening an investigation into Hardwick's dealings," she said mildly. "I imagine your name will surface in it, Mr. Pemberton." A short laugh escaped him, not humor, not relief, just something tired. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "It means people will finally know the truth." Pemberton let out a breath, turning toward her. "But it won't change anything, will it?" he said quietly. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "No," she admitted. "But the truth has a way of settling in the end, even if it takes longer than it should." Pemberton looked away, his fingers tightening against the fabric of his coat. "Hardwick took 20 years from me," he murmured. 20 years, my career, my reputation, and now he's dead, and I don't even know how I feel about it." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "Perhaps," she said softly, "because there's nothing left to feel. It was taken from you long ago." Pemberton swallowed, his jaw working as he absorbed the words. Then, after a long moment, he gave a slight nod. "I suppose," he said. "That'll have to do." Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the distant hills, watching as the motor car carrying Beatrice Lansing disappeared beyond the mist. Applecross Station, once a place of secrets and silence, was quiet once more. But now, at least, the truth had been spoken. And sometimes that was all that mattered. By midday, Applecross Station was returning to what it had always been, a quiet, forgotten place, where the wind carried whispers of journeys taken long ago. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a washed-out shade of blue, streaked with pale sunlight that cast long shadows across the platform. Inside the waiting room, Miss Marple and Mrs. Hardwick sat across from each other, a single pot of tea between them. The station was calmer now, but the night's events still lingered like the scent of burnt wick after a candle has been snuffed out. Mrs. Hardwick stirred her tea absently, her eyes distant. "Beatrice never had a chance," she murmured. "Not really?" Miss Marple's gaze was sympathetic but steady. "No," she said. "She didn't. There was no triumph in the solving of this case. Only a weary sort of inevitability." Mrs. Hardwick let out a slow breath, watching the steam curl from her cup. "And the others?" she asked. "The men Hardwick blackmailed? The ones he still had his hooks in?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "Some will be relieved he's gone," she said. "Some will be frightened of what comes next. And others—" She paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the delicate rim of her teacup. "Others will take his place." A chill settled between them despite the warmth of the tea. Mrs. Hardwick's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "Then it wasn't really justice at all," she said. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, considering. "Justice," she said, "is rarely perfect. It comes in fragments and half-measures. It rarely cleans the slate, and more often than not, it leaves behind just enough to remind us that some things never fully disappear." Mrs. Hardwick said nothing, but her expression spoke of a woman who had learned that lesson long ago. Miss Marple took another sip of her tea. "It's not about wiping away the past, my dear," she said gently. "It's about making sure the right people carry its weight." Beyond the window, a handful of travelers waited on the platform, shifting their suitcases, glancing at their watches. The train would be here soon. Miss Marple watched them. her sharp eyes noting the unconcerned ease with which they stood, oblivious to the drama that had played out in this forgotten station the night before. A few feet away, Leonard Pemberton lingered near the ticket counter, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost somewhere in the distance. His name might never be fully cleared, but for the first time in 20 years he wasn't carrying the burden of a lie he hadn't told. Miss Marple had seen it before, the hollow victory of the falsely accused. Some truths set men free, others simply left them adrift. The train's whistle echoed across the station, its deep metallic groan cutting through the still morning air. Miss Marple gathered her handbag, smoothing her skirt before rising. Mrs. Hardwick glanced up at her. "You're leaving, then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There's nothing left to be done here," she said. "The past has already settled into its proper place." Mrs. Hardwick looked as though she might argue, but instead she only nodded. Miss Marple turned toward the door, stepping out onto the platform bathed in thin winter sunlight. She took a final glance at Applecross Station, a place that had once held secrets in its walls, in its ledgers, in its locked doors. Secrets that had been dragged into the light. She boarded the train without looking back. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, but enough.